Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our panel discussion on the Russian war on Ukraine and the perspective of the role that public opinion, media, and censorship are playing in this war that Russia has launched against the independent Republic of Ukraine. My name is Erik Nisbet. I am a professor of policy analysis and communication and director for the Center for Communication and Public Policy in the School of Communication at Northwestern University. And I have the pleasure of hosting our panel discussion, being the moderator today. We have invited 3 experts on Russian public opinion, media, journalism, international broadcasting in Russia to provide their input and expertise on this question of what is going inside Russia, the role of public opinion, and Russian propaganda in this war. Our first panelist is Olga Kamenchuk. She is an associate professor of research and instruction at Northwestern University. She has 15 years of professional polling and public research experience in the former Soviet Union and is a leading expert on Russian public opinion. Her scholarship focuses on international public opinion and strategic public diplomacy. Our second panelist is Vasily Gatov, who is a senior fellow at U.S. Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy, and an expert on Russian media. Prior to joining USC, he worked as a journalist for prominent Russian media organizations for 20 years. His last position was director of Novosti Media Lab for RIA Novosti. Jeffrey Trimble is our third panelist. Jeff is the former deputy director of the U.S. Global Media Agency, formerly known as the Broadcast Board of Governors, the main international broadcasting and media agency for the United States. He was the former acting president of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and the former Moscow bureau chief for U.S. News and World Report. He is currently a lecturer at The Ohio State University School of Communication. Jeffrey has over 30 years of experience as an international journalist, editor, and media manager. He's fluent in Russian and is expert on international and Russian media. So today we're going to have a conversation about Russian propaganda, Russian media, Russian public opinion in the context of its war on Ukraine. We will have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions in our Q&A session at the end of today's panel discussion. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat as we have our conversation, or post them at the end of our moderated discussion, and our experts will be able to address them at the end of today's panel. We'll reserve hopefully at least 30 minutes for your questions and comments. All right. So my first question today is directed to Olga. And the focus is on this question of Russian public opinion. And Olga, can you give us some context for the audience and us to understand how does the Russian public view Russia's invasion and war on Ukraine? Do they support it? Do they have an accurate understanding of what the Putin regime is doing in Ukraine? The level of violence, the level of military action, and its targeting of civilians, for example. How does public opinion in Russia right now compare to public opinion when Russia launches war against Georgia, for example, or the Crimean annexation, or support for the Russian separatist, ethnic separatists in Donbass? And among this public opinion, among those who supports the war and who is against the war, give us sort of a broad picture of what's going on right now in the minds of everyday Russians around this war in Ukraine.
Thank you, Erik. Yes, so by now, when we are already 3 weeks into the war that Russia wages against Ukraine, we already have actually quite some polls. So I analyzed polls from 5 companies or associations, not all of them were done by companies. So some polls were done by large institutions, others by independent groups of pollsters who would unite to collect the data for free and to freely distribute them. And even some pollsters already have 3 waves of polls, so you can see the trends, how public opinion developed and changed. They would use comparative instruments or change the wording to see if even different ways of calling the war affects the opinion of Russians. So majority of Russians do support the war that their country is waging against Ukraine. There are, however, some important nuances to this support. The support was around 57 to 65% at the beginning of the invasion, depending on the pollster, which is nothing like the so-called Crimean consensus in the Russian society in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. That was about 90%, even 95%, depending on the poll, that Russians, approved of that annexation, regardless of the age, level of education, or even ideology. So not only loyalists, for example, supported annexation of Crimea at that time, but even many opposition-minded Russians supported it too. So we do see support now, but it's far from universal that we have seen years ago, and it's quite shaky, actually. 2 factors seem to be associated with support for the war. Age and media use are the major ones. Less than 1/3 of young Russians, those who are aged 25 years and less, support the war. Again, less than 1/3. And more than 70% of elderly Russians do, that Soviet kind of generation. Intensive internet and social media use, international social media use, seems to be associated with less support for the war, while high reliance on TV as the major source of information is associated with higher support for the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Wording also seems to matter. For example, as some audience might know, but some maybe not, it's prohibited to use the word war when people in Russia talk about the war in Ukraine. Media can use only the word special operation or sometimes special military operation, and that's it. And there are severe laws which were adopted recently for spreading fakes about the war, but actually those are not fakes. That's actually telling the truth about, about the war. Those would be jail sentences from 3 to 20 years, depending on what is done. The result is numerous opposition media stopped covering the war and some was shut down by the Kremlin. Why? Well, propaganda makes all the effort to make sure that people do not see this war as a war. And we researchers see through our experiments that if we ask respondents about their opinion regarding the war and call it a war, we see much smaller support for it than if we use the loud term special operation. Thus, when we think how accurately people understand what is happening in Ukraine, we should bear in mind that those people are largely cut off the honest, true information. And once they are given the clearer picture, attitude can change.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you for those insights. I guess a follow-up question is, quickly, do you see support for what is literally the war in Ukraine, not a special military operation? Do you see it stable, growing, diminishing? I mean, there has been protests. There have been people, some people have spoken out against the war. There have been petitions against the war from some academic institutions or alumni, for example, of one of the major universities, the International State University in Moscow, McGimo. Alumni have signed a petition. Those who oppose the war have fled Russia to other countries. Do you see any of that influencing public opinion for the better or worse trend, or is it pretty stable right now?
Yes, you're right. There have been quite some petitions lately. First came from GIMO, which is a Moscow State University of International Relations, pretty much like Russian Harvard. About by now, over 2,000 people have signed the petition condemning the war, but now the organizers have covered the names of these people as due to the new laws, it's dangerous for these people. They might end up in jail. Then there's also actually just a couple of days ago, Moscow State University, another leading university, over 4,000 researchers and professors and students and alumni signed the open letter condemning the war. So there is quite some intellectuals opposing it. Media and journalists as well. There was another letter by the journalists. However, I have to say that if we look at the developments, and as I said, there were several waves of polls done by now, right, in this 3-week period, we see that all political ratings, rankings, and indices grew since the start of the war. For example, Putin's rating grew 7 to 10%, depending on the pollster. Support for the war also grew 7 to 10% in the meantime, also depending on the pollster. So the rally around the flag is something we have seen, as it usually happens in the start of the war in many societies. However, as the war continues, more and more questions can arise. Sanctions can and will affect the public opinion in the long run, from my perspective. As economic well-being goes down, we will see not only intellectuals, these professors and alumni of the top schools, not only larger metropolitan areas, residents such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, not only youth who are going to protest, not only students who are protesting, but we may also see growing discontent of those majorities that have been remaining silent up until today. President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed Russians several times about necessity to protest this war. He addressed them in Russian language. He's a known media personality, pretty well known in Russia even before he became a president. He's a celebrity in his past life, so he has strong symbolic power too to be able to encourage these people. He also just recently talked about the courage of Russian editor Marina Ovsyannikova, who protested the war yesterday in the top news program in the prime time. So, following, we have to say that following that, several prominent journalists from leading state-controlled media resigned too, just today. I know some of them personally. One of them worked in the top media since 1993. So they're really there for decades. So things are changing, though slower than some of us would want, but we have hope that it will affect. However, all these people, so far, this is kind of a tip of the iceberg, so to say. Russia is a very large country, 140 million people live in it. So hundreds of thousands of people or tens of thousands of people protesting, that's still not majority.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you for the context. So this, and I think Olga alluded to this, and this leads into my question to you, Vasily. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian media system has been this hybrid of government-owned media and private commercial media. There was a period of a moderate amount of press freedom and opposition media in the 1990s, early 2000s. But over the last 10 or 15 years, this has been eroded to actually what we see now disappearing, with the last opposition TV channel closing recently. Can you talk about your personal experience as a journalist in this context? You lived through this, right? And you actually left Russia as press freedom started to erode. And so from your perspective, from your and personal perspective, as well as your professional context and personal context in Russia, how do journalists navigate this? Media is so powerful, as Olga said. There's a divide among those who are relying upon like state TV or state influence TV and those who do not in their opinions about the war. How do journalists, how did you navigate this government control and promoting propaganda with your own sense of being a journalist? I'm thinking of the example that Olga brought up of this journalist yesterday, this TV editor and producer for, I believe, Channel 1, who interrupted a live news cast to protest the war. What role does the media play in this? How do they navigate this? And are they willing participants in the promotion and spread of this propaganda, or are they coerced, or is it a mix? Can you give us some perspective?
Yeah, I will try to kind of itemize my answer,
Sure.
And because there's so many questions within this one. I answering about myself. My first report was published in January 1985, and it was my story of how I got to the Soviet Army and how I served. It was in Moskovsky Komsomol. It's the major Russian youth newspaper. And then I covered very different things. Starting from Chernobyl nuclear accident, the wars on the margins of the Soviet Union when it was falling apart, Chechnya, politics quite extensively. I think that your assumption about freedom of the press in 90s, no, Russia was a free country in the 90s. I mean, Boris Yeltsin, who personally was, although pretty autocratic, valued free press very much, even if he disliked what they've been writing about him and his rule. But until he was alive, the press was protected. The freedom of the press was protected. And the influence of the government, even on the channels that were either owned by the state or partly owned, was minimal. And they didn't even have structures during the Yeltsin time to exert this influence. The structures were built on this edge between Yeltsin and Putin 10 years, and they became pretty influential by the time of the Beslan attack. And actually, first real signs of the existing censorship in state media were evident with the terrorist attacks in Beslan and at the Moscow Theater in Dubrovka next year. Since then, Russian media is under constant pressure from the government, from presidential administration, and it's not like it's crumbling all the time. I mean, it's like this kind of discrete process, like stability, and what had happened recently when Kremlin proactively decided to close down Echo Moskvy, block TV Rain, and literally exclude dozens of websites that were just covering news from the Russian internet space. That's kind of sealing, I mean, cement sealing of Russian press freedom. Then the second thing is how the journalist feel himself in kind of censorship situation, or in a situation when what he does, what he says, what he writes are controlled by state. When I started work in Soviet Union, we had censorship. It was a preliminary censorship. Every article before it went to print was read by a special person called censor, and he vetted it, that there is nothing incompatible with the communist values or disclosing state secrets. The censorship which existed in Soviet Union was different from what you may kind of know from the books, because, for example, it was a censorship of libraries, it was censorship of archives, it was censorship of plays or of movies. Like foreign movies were shown in Soviet Union with pieces cut out because, I mean, the censors decided that they're inappropriate for Russians. So then kind of living in this condition teaches you to use Aesopian language first, because, I mean, you are becoming capable of explaining things that you're not allowed to say openly. Novaya Gazeta, that decided to survive at the price of not saying war, with their last 3 issues, demonstrate that they do know Ethiopian language, and they do understand how to make it powerful. Like one of the spreads of Novaya Gazeta is published absolutely empty with a small tiny note in the left upper corner saying, here is everything we wanted to tell you about what is not allowed to be named. So that's pretty awful, and it doesn't make people stronger or determined. It consumes you, because if you got a talent of storyteller, or you got a talent of presenter, if you got a talent of writing, you become kind of intertwined with things that are bad, that are definitely evil, and then you can just feel yourself like you have leeches on you that suck the blood of your creativity, of your talent all the time. And the fourth part of the question was whether this is uncrackable, that this is like a thing that cannot be altered and changed. First, I think we see the situation, which is completely unique. This is a war which is happening in highly connected society. Not only connected digitally with new tools, social networks, gadgets, and so on, but also that's the war between countries which are so interconnected on a family level. Like, just from the latest census, 11 million people in Russia are Ukrainians in their passports. And amount of Russians living in Ukraine, but feeling themselves Ukrainians by nationality is also about almost 20 million. And waging war in 2014, I mean, yes, this war is going for 8 years, to be honest. I mean, is an insanity, is things that one can't imagine, as well as you can't imagine what will be an outcome of the war in such a connected society. So we cannot make any predictions. I mean, the things that may happen could be very small. Like we all know the Bouazizi effect. Yeah, the small guy from the market in Tunisia, I mean, was so offended with the male policewoman, that he put himself on fire, and that kind of destroyed Tunisian regime, which looked absolutely solid just 2 days before. Similar in Egypt. We don't know how it happens. I mean, this is something that we as journalists, as reporters, as scientists, I mean, have an awfully tragic chance to learn now. But here I stop.
Thank you, and thank you for the insights. That's really interesting. I think the question is: there a tipping point, a threshold effect? I know many of you, you know, and many. I know Olga has family in Ukraine. You know, has her father was born in Ukraine, right? You know, and the journalist yesterday who protested, her father was born in Ukraine and you know, Russian. So there are these beyond, you know, these ties, right? That you know, create possibly openings that go beyond the media, or that go beyond the propaganda, in terms of these familial and personal ties between the two countries, which makes it all more tragic, the Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Jeff, you know, you come from a different perspective. You worked for years, in many ways, trying to pierce the propaganda bubble inside Russia, right? With providing actual factual information through, you know, Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, Current Times. You've worked as a foreign correspondent on the ground in Russia. So my question to you is, in response to this new law that has been alluded to already, the Putin government decreed that those who spread fake news, which ironically is accurate news about the war in Ukraine, including international media organizations, might be jailed up to 15 years, right? And in response, a lot of organizations have pulled out their journalists or are no longer reporting on the ground in Russia. So how should foreign media organizations approach this question about providing insights about what's happening in Russia, as well as trying to provide information to Russians and pierce this propaganda bubble, whether it's private media, commercial media, or state-sponsored media from the West, right? From Germany, from BBC, from US. Like, how would you approach this issue and problem?
Whole package of great questions, Erik, and I look forward to discussing them with Olga and you and with Vasily as well. And perhaps by way of opening to help further set the context of this, I'm reminded of something in Vasily's comments about the 1990s. And it's a trivia question, but it's a trivia question with a substantive underlying meaning. In the history of the Russian Federation, there has only been one instance of a presidential decree by a president of Russia being rescinded by a subsequent president of Russia. One time. Guess what it was? In August of 1991, Boris Yeltsin, then president, issued a decree giving Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, accreditation and allowing it to open a bureau in Moscow. In 2002, President Putin rescinded that decree. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty continued to operate in Russia, and it's also a way to make the point that what we're seeing in Russia today is the end product of a long process. This is not something that's happened quickly. It's the end of a long process, but also at just how relatively open that media environment was inside Russia in the 1990s. And I would submit, and Vasily and Olga may push back on this, I would go back into the 1980s as well, that while glasnost was introduced as a tool to be used by Mikhail Gorbachev and Alexander Yakovlev and others who were attempting to reform Soviet society, a tool to help them achieve their aims, it's a tool that very quickly got out of control and in fact ultimately contributed to the demise of the Soviet Union through giving people more access to information and making them more discontented in the system in which they were living. Now, directly to your question, the lot of a foreign correspondent in Russia and the Soviet Union has never been an easy one. Throughout the entire Soviet period, foreign journalists, although they were accredited, they were able to live in the Soviet Union, they were based in Moscow, were constantly surrounded and frustrated in their efforts to genuinely get some idea of what was happening around them. And that produced horrible distortions in reporting about the Soviet Union, going back to Walter Durante for the New York Times in the 1930s, not reporting accurately about the purges, not reporting about the famine in Ukraine. So there's no question that the Soviet system worked its way around those of us based in Moscow to shape our perceptions and to limit our access to accurate information about what was going on. And by necessity, we'd find ourselves as journalists in the Soviet Union, at least, and to some extent after that, speaking more with people who were perhaps important potentially as change agents, but they weren't genuinely representative of the system. And I'm speaking of the dissidents, the refuseniks, and others who were important, certainly, but they didn't represent mainstream thought. This only changed to some extent in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, when I agree, things sort of completely opened up. And Boris Yeltsin did not see the media and the foreign media as something he might manipulate. He pretty much let the chips fall where they may in terms of reporting. Journalists will continue to get the story out of Russia and about what's happening in Russia. They have a lot of experience with reporting about denied media environments, whether it's Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Afghanistan under the Taliban, or Turkmenistan, or North Korea. There are techniques, and those techniques are facilitated and enriched in the digital era where you can continue to have contact. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America had strong contacts with audiences in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, often in written form, anonymous letters. They were able eventually to speak with people on the phone and get information. So I don't doubt that information about Russia and what's happening there will continue to reach Western audiences. I must say, though, I am struck and disheartened to see the New York Times feeling so concerned about the situation that their almost century-long presence in that part of the world with a Moscow bureau has at least temporarily been suspended. I see the BBC briefly suspended and then returned with some English language content being produced out of Moscow. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has suspended its operations inside the Russian Federation as a result of a combination of factors that I'd be happy to go into when we specifically talk about the international broadcasting situation. But I guess I would just wrap up by saying that, the news will continue to come out of Russia. The internet digital genie is out of the bottle in Russia. It's always been out of the bottle because the internet took shape in Russia in a different way than it did in China, for instance. It took shape in that free 90s, and it's much tougher to put that genie back in the bottle. We'll be playing a cat and mouse game about accessing people and content in Russia, as Russian citizens already are doing. But that will be a part of the landscape going forward. And I'm not necessarily pessimistic about information moving across the borders going forward, but it's going to take a lot of creativity. And in follow-up, I'd be glad to talk about some of the techniques and ways that US international broadcasting, at least, is continuing to reach audiences inside Russia. So maybe I'll stop with that for the moment and get ready to jump into more conversation with the other panelists.
Right, and so I think that is a segue to a question I want to ask all three of you, and get all of your perspectives. Is how do we pierce Putin's propaganda bubble, right? That they have built through both mass media, news media, as well as closing online spaces, closing opposition blogs, closing down access to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram just went down, for example. Basically they've, the Russian government has tried to create this bubble around the Russian public of propaganda in general and the war specifically. Is the Russian public aware of this? What media do they trust? What media do they not trust? And what are the ways, why? Like, is it they simply do not seek out foreign media? Is it not access to them? There is access to VPNs on some of the social media. I know there's been polling on some of these questions. I know, Jeff and Vasily, you approach it from a journalism perspective, media production. I would love to get some perspectives from all three of you on this question, especially from a policy perspective. What can we do from the West to help provide alternative information or information outside the propaganda that the Russian public is receiving to address this issue, this problem? Jeff, you have your hand up. I'll start with you, and then we'll move on to our other panels.
I would just suggest in a sentence that for framing purposes, the answer to that question lies in two areas. One is technical means. How do we physically get information to individuals whose access to that is being blocked? And the other, which I believe is more challenging and which I'm going to yield to my colleagues to respond to, is how to open the minds of Russians to be amenable to taking in that information and processing it in some kind, using some level of critical thinking, which I would submit is absent in a large part of the Russian population, in part due to the education system and history, to be able to take that information and to compare it to other information available to them through their own official sources and make sense of it. So I think actually that part of it is probably more complicated than the technical. So I would yield on that part of it for starters, but I'm happy to speak in a few minutes about the technical side of how you get information to people.
Well, I think that leads into then, Olga, for example, in terms of public opinion, you've written some of your research about the so-called psychological firewall where Russians basically, alluding to what Jeff said, is, are not necessarily open to alternative sources of information or don't necessarily actively seek it out or might actually avoid it. what does the polling, what is the research on this question from the public view tell us about what sources of information are trusted or not trusted, and how they are open to information, and how do we get through to Russians? Can you give us some perspective on that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, indeed, and there are some things which work with Russians or not work with Russians, same as somebody else in the world. People might block themselves from even looking for information, or even if they find the information which opposes their beliefs, they don't want to believe that. Often, even they don't believe. Sometimes they don't even believe their close relatives. As with regards to this war in Ukraine that Russia is waging, we have heard numerous accounts when relatives don't believe their closest relatives who are right there. However, there are some ways how we can try to affect this bubble. In one way, I think we can use our knowledge and experience from other cases when we try to deal with misinformation and disinformation in other cases, like COVID-related and so on. Looks like new media, but also closest channels, that is, relatives can still affect if they are influenced as well. There is a reason why Russian government is blocking Facebook and Twitter, for example, or Instagram. Those are the media they can't really control, and that's the media where audiences, especially prime audiences or leaders of public opinion, are getting alternative information, right? And even though Facebook would have only like 14% of Russians using it, this hasn't been the most popular social media, for example, in Russia, yet many people who can be referred as leaders of public opinion were the ones using it. So still finding a way of affecting these leaders of public opinion and then bringing the stories to the homes of Russians and the families so they affect each other is one way. By the way, VPNs exist. And as a person who is using social media, not only with my American friends and colleagues or European friends and colleagues, I also have relatives and friends in Ukraine and in Russia, I see that many are still there. Many are using VPNs and still communicating and getting this information. Many people in Russia, however, started to post in very closed circles, not only for friends, but very selective circle of friends. And if you are there, you will be able to see this news. Yet by influencing, even through this means, we will be able to have to bring the alternative story. A Telegram, a popular messenger, was, for example, attempted to be blocked some time ago by the local regulator Roskomnadzor. Well, it didn't work out. It's still there, and even state servants and civil servants and all these bureaucrats are still using it. I think that, and now many people from Facebook and Instagram have ran to Telegram, by the way. So I think social media primarily would be something that would help us deal with that. And many international media have accounts in social media, so they can still bring their stories, such as Current Times, for example, right? You can watch it through Facebook as well. And affecting relatives. Just as with the cases of COVID misinformation, we see that relatives can have some effect and some influence on opinion of their relatives. That's why we see so many emails. And that's why, for example, Ukraine is making so many attempts to reach out to mothers of those soldiers who have been taken as prisoners of war, to have them spread the story, right? We'll see how successful it will be, but I think that could be the possibility. In general, in the public opinion, we see that currently two types of media have the largest influence, TV and social media, TV and internet in general. Internet has grown significantly and the trend is going up still. So right now, both TV, which is predominantly state-controlled, and internet is still, you can hear the alternative stories, is not so much controlled, even though there's significant regulation measures which were taken. But bearing in mind that this new media, social media and internet have still significant role, even with all these regulations, I think there's something which gives us a key to the minds of Russians to help them see the real truth.
Right. But and social media is a very important avenue. That's one reason the Russian government has tried to limit or block it. I guess the question is, how, as you said, so what percentage of Russians are using like Facebook, Twitter? It's a small percentage, right?
Yeah.
Primarily it's the Russian social media that's the most popular.
Yeah, well, Russians use social media very actively, and in general, in the former Soviet space, if we don't take Baltic states, Russian internet market and audience has the highest penetration rate, so it's very active. However, majority of Russians, if we talk about social media, use in Vkontakte or Одноклассники, which are Russian social media, severely controlled, and with all that comes with that. However, there were some Russians who were also using Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. About some years ago, it would be like, for example, about 20% who would use Facebook. Right now, only 14. Actually, before the recent blockings, only 14. It went down recently, and I think it would go even further down. However, there's still significant amount of people are using it, and I want to emphasize the kind of people who are using it. Leaders of public opinion. They can be the centers of those networks and spread the stories further on. That's very important.
Right, they're the influentials, they're the elites,
Exactly.
Intellectually, economic elites. Vasily, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, well, I would say that Instagram is very popular in Russia. At the moment when Russian government started blocking it, was about 70 million accounts. So it's about fourfold of Facebook. And the other thing about Instagram is that the whole infrastructure of the small businesses in Russia was connected to Instagram bloggers who promoted, gave discount coupons and so on through their vast networks of followers, and these people are extremely angry right now, not only because they cannot post their nail polish or stupid videos, but because the advertising stopped. With advertising stops the business. Excuse me, and that's an important source of discontent. As far as technical means are concerned, again, I agree with Jeff. I mean, Russian internet was born in the period of almost absolute freedom, especially in parts of development of technology. I don't think that the Russian government even knows all the gateways that connect Russian internet to the world. And internet as a technology is working very differently from what a person with medieval thinking, like Putin and his censors, think. So they only can think in pyramid hierarchy, that somebody decides what is on internet and what is not. And the internet was always kind of insurgent media, and it will find its way to Russian brains. I also want to say that whatever support polling shows today to kind of Putin and the war, that's, from the communication science perspective, that's a result of very hard priming, a military class propaganda which cannot sustain long. Although that's a very strong media effect, it's never long. And in order to keep it working, you need to have a fully totalitarian state and fully totalitarian society that instills these messages on the public, that makes people frightened for even having an opposite view. And when you have at least 25% of the population and almost 75% of young people being not that comfortable, I would say very carefully, with this war and with propaganda as well. That's an extremely dangerous experiment, which I would say is like, well, I mean, each of us lived in Moscow for some time, so we know that cotton trees in June, they really kind of, the Moscow streets are covered with cotton. It's like bringing lighter to this cotton bubbles, and further restrictions that come both from sanctions and from actions of Russian government, like computer gaming getting out of Russia. I mean, you can't imagine what does it mean for a person addicted to computer games that they cannot download games on Steam or play Dota or Counter-Strike. And believe me, I mean, they know whom to play.
I'm just looking at Washington Post figures on usage of social media platforms, and I would submit that an important, I think, indicator going forward is if and when they block YouTube. If you consider YouTube to be social media site, because just about everybody on the internet in Russia, 74.5%, according to this, active users of the internet use YouTube. Is that a step too far for the Russian government? Would that, in fact, create the kind of pushback? Instagram came close. We all saw the postings of the incredibly unhappy people, as Vasily has just said, who've lost their social connections, who've lost their livelihood, who've lost their connection to the outside world, but they have held off and not gone after YouTube. And that might be the kind of tipping point one. If they're cautious about that, it shows perhaps they are concerned about public pushback. If they go ahead and block it, I think it will tell us something else about the situation there. I would say that, you know, from the point of view of U.S. international broadcasting, and I'll stick with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, with all respect to my Voice of America colleagues, I just know the RFERL landscape a bit better. So the Russians have blocked 9 Russian language websites of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and those are the main ones in sort of smaller subsets that were geographically devoted to a particular part of the country. But it already was the case in almost every instance that RFERL was drawing larger audiences through their apps and other means than through the websites. And the apps that people have on their smartphones that they were cautioned to download as quickly as possible have built-in VPN technology to help circumvent blockage. This was something U.S. international broadcasting did with a lot of experience in places like China of how to peer. So there are these tools in place. They're what we call mirror sites. Most people know mirror site. It's the same website, but it has a different address. So you access it in a way that the censors or the blockers don't know how to block it. And I agree with Vasily's sentiment. I think that the Russian internet is enough of a hodgepodge mess that it's fairly difficult for them to really get a handle without cutting themselves off completely from the rest of the world, which would be its own kind of statement, sovereign internet, trying to do what Iran, China, and others have done. And separate question, are we really looking at the end of the World Wide Web? But that's a different direction to take the conversation. We will have to see. So I think I would just urge audience here, watch what they do with YouTube, watch what they do with some of these other platforms they have not yet blocked, and what additional steps they're taking against individuals for what they're posting on social media as to be an indication about how comfortable the Russian authorities are about pressing ahead and punishing people and continuing to restrict access to information, or whether they think they've pushed it as far as they can.
Are those the technical means you're talking about? You mentioned reference, Jeff. There are other technical means to bypass the online censorship. You mentioned apps. Are there others?
Apps, mirror sites, VPNs, and the one that seems to be particularly gathering strength for use in Russia is EnthLink, ENTHLINK, EnthLink. and on all the social media platforms, such as Telegram, not yet blocked. They haven't been able to block. The Belarusians, by the way, also had a lot of trouble trying to figure out how to block Telegram, YouTube, and on the blocked ones, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Back to the Future, the BBC has now several hours a day back on shortwave radio into Russia, as does U.S. international broadcasting through a private initiative. The agency overseeing U.S. international media has not restarted shortwave broadcasting into Russia, but there's a private effort that now has leased some frequencies and put on some programming. Okay, very few people in Russia have shortwave radio receivers today. I think most people younger than 40 have probably never seen one. So you may reach very limited audiences, but under the situation we're in, why not? More promising would be medium wave radio, which we call AM radio, which propagates particularly well at nighttime, except in cities where electronic interference bothers it. So there are efforts to get medium wave broadcasting in from the Baltics, from Poland, and from other places, which has the other advantage of you can listen to it in your car. So the radio technology is being reintroduced. I suspect that it will be with limited success reaching audiences, but at this point you try everything.
Old is new again, right? So,
you know, Eric, I forgot one more thing. All of these programs are available on satellites. The problem is that people in Russia watch satellite television the way we do here in the US. They buy packages provided by a provider, their versions of Dish TV, for instance, and you only get the channels set up for your receiver that are in your package. If you can retune your receiver, you can pull down off the satellites because all the signals of US international broadcasting and the other major international broadcasters are open, they're not encoded. You can retune your satellite receiver and receive those signals in your home, but it's the modern day equivalent of the old day shortwave of having to fiddle around in order to avoid jamming. So the satellite programs are there if people are willing to take the technological steps needed in order to pull them in.
Great.
I just have one. The biggest test for, I just completely kind of with Jeff on the last point. There'll be a World Soccer Cup in November, as far as I remember, in Kuwait. FIFA already said that Russia would not be given rights because it's excluded from FIFA. That would be an interesting moment, an interesting test. How many people who have satellite dishes would try to find out how to watch soccer, which they really love. And Russia already had been cut from UK Premier League, from Serie A, Italian, and so on, because they just decided not to license the programs. So I think that thing with satellite dishes will return much faster than we understand, and then people will go and watch news as well.
Interesting. Yeah, the cultural dimensions, and I think that is another dimension to the communication is the as part of the sanctions, the response to Russia's war on aggression, a lot of cultural, social institutions, academic, there has been an isolation of Russia. There's been even calls in the United States by some politicians to kick out all Russian students. There has been, debates on how to handle the fact that the rectors and chancellors of all the major Russian universities who are appointed by the Putin government came out with a letter in support of the war. But then how do academic institutions manage these relationships, right? And we think about media as a form of communication. Well, these other institutions, often academic exchanges, students overseas, academic collaborations, social and cultural, these often are back channels, right, of communication. And often you see some of the main opposition to the war are among some of these institutions, yet at the same time, they are controlled, funded, and instruments of the state. So there's this tension here from a policy perspective of how do we respond, sanction, isolate Russia due to its war of aggression against Ukraine, while at the same time maintaining avenues of communication, whether it's media or otherwise, with possible social, cultural, academic institutions that are also often the well springs of opposition to the war inside Russia. How do we manage this, complex relationship? Do you have any opinions or ideas about that?
I would
Jeff,
say that
anyone?
on the media, just one more follow-up on the media side of how to address that. If you look historically at the programming of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America during the Cold War, the overall tone of the programming was remarkably sympathetic and empathetic toward the Russian people. It did not seek to define them as enemies. It acted as a kind of a reservoir of Russian culture, of Russian language, of Russian history that was denied to people by the Soviet system, but in a way that was sympathetic to audiences. So how to retain in communications with Russians sympathy and empathy for the very great things that Russia has to offer the world and that it has offered the world, while at the same time delivering the real message of the real situation, is a challenge that historically, if you look back, was addressed in that manner during the Cold War.
Helpful. Vasily, Olga, do you have any ideas about how do we properly sanction and isolate Russia in response to its war of aggression, while at the same time trying to maintain different channels of communication that might influence public opinion or be able to support those who are opposed to war inside Russia? How do we navigate this?
Well, you rightly said that presidents of the universities in Russia are appointed and dependent on these officials who do so. Knowing how things work in Russia, I wonder even if all of those who signed the letter even were aware of this letter, and even if they were much asked about it. At the same time, there are numerous researchers and alumni and students who study or work or studied at the same universities who are opposing it and also writing letters in opposition. And by the way, risking again many years of jail sentences. So what I would say, we might consider sanctioning institutions as a whole, but keeping the personal ties and keeping knowledge about what is happening on the ground is extremely important for the future. Making ourselves blind would be dangerous for us as well. Keeping human contact, even if we disagree personally in some respects, can provide potential for changing the minds and opinions and getting this information from the sources on the ground. And also, again, let's not forget about the track 2 diplomacy, right? When the traditional diplomacy fails, maybe we can use the other approaches too. In Soviet times, it was much harder. As that time, we couldn't build largely this communication, but even then there were some contacts. Nowadays, trying to keep contacts with local researchers and scholars is extremely important. We have to be very careful about keeping their anonymity in some ways. For example, for some data when I get from people who are on the ground, they specifically emphasize they do not want to be mentioned. They are really risking. Again, like protesting in Paris or in Chicago is not the same as protesting in Moscow. Completely different consequences that these people are facing. So I think it's extremely important that we keep this context. But then there is another thing. By coming up with these ridiculous things as kicking out students that are here in the United States, we also kind of provide food to the propaganda there, trying to show them, because, Russian propaganda has used this Russophobia stories numerously, many times, in most cases overwhelming. Those were not true. But pointing out that, this poor student was kicked out because this, and that, we are helping them by feeding this propaganda effort. We don't want that.
Thank you.
Well, I think that I just want to reiterate, we are in a very early stage of this story. It will take months, probably, to see the compound effect of both sanctions, clever or stupid, of actions by kind of private, public, and institutions in regard to Russia, or Russian culture, or Russian literature, or Russian media. And I probably would say this is the situation when actively nobody in clear mind should not support canceling of Russia. Even if you feel so, you don't have to support it. Yeah, because I mean, not only that feeds propaganda on the other side, but it also creates a sense of, among Russians, even among Russians who are very sympathetic to the West and so on, of abandonment, of like that they've been thrown out from the global culture, global development. So however angry you are on Russians and however you support Ukrainians, don't don't kill the mockingbird in even your soul.
Olga, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I want to add to what Vasily said about the sentiment among the opposition-minded Russians as well now. There is quite some disappointment right now among Russians and Belarusians, as far as I know, but mostly Russians, that Russians protested. There were mass protests in 2011, 2012, following the fraudulent elections in Russia. Belarusians protested a year ago during those elections too, and they were asking for sanctions and much higher participation of the West to support the opposition movement in Russia. And they say, well, unfortunately, we didn't get that. This is not entirely true, though, because United States did impose sanctions following the assassination attempt of Mr. Navalny. As we know, Mr. Biden imposed some sanctions too. But yet, Russians point out at the attempts when they were trying to fight that regime which was coming back in 2011 and 12, coming back, right, the second coming of Putin to power. And they are very upset that when we were protesting that, the West kind of was relatively indifferent to this situation. And right now, there's, the opposition in Russia is beheaded. Some leaders of opposition were assassinated, like Boris Nemtsov. Some are in jail, like Alexei Navalny. And by the way, right now, there is another sentence that he's facing, about 13 to 15 years in jail for another sentence. And many opposition leaders are in exile. Whatever we see right now in Russia, the protest activity in Russia that we are seeing, mostly it's spontaneous and unled by prominent figures. And I want to emphasize that already dozens of thousands of Russians protested the war, more than 40 cities in the country, and 15,000 of people were arrested, beaten up, and are facing sentences. So this is happening again. And these people also need support. And that's why President Zelensky was also talking to these people, addressing these people. However, protesting in Russia, especially in Russia of 2022, it's not like it was protesting in Russia in 2012, or it's like protesting in the United States or in France or somewhere else.
Right, and obviously you're right, the stakes are much higher for those who are protesting in Russia. The question is, how do we break through the Russian propaganda, the domestic propaganda? Will the protests have a meaningful influence on public opinion? Will mounting casualties? That's one of the questions. It's not being covered, but will that break through as the reality of Russian casualties in the war in Ukraine increase? It'll be harder and harder to possibly cover up. How do we break through more psychologically or message-wise to the Russian public? What messages may break through the propaganda? What messages do not? Like what what are we left with in terms of like, how do we get through to the Russian public past the dominant Russian media narratives that, you know, some through social media, but for the majority of Russians, how do we break through? How do we break through to change minds among those who support it? Any suggestions or ideas?
So traditionally in US international broadcasting, and it's really baked into the formula of US international broadcasting and into the 1994 law, which is the most recent legislation, the US International Broadcasting Act, that shapes the mission of US international broadcasting. The mandate is to provide multiple perspectives, to give people full access to information so that they can make up their own minds about the situation. And that gets to the issue of credibility. When people hear robust debate around an issue, it can enhance credibility because they think, wait a minute, there are different perspectives and people arguing on different sides of an issue. Maybe I should pay attention to that content rather than, gee, it turns out what I've been hearing from my particular side or my favorite media is just what they want me to know. I don't know if that equation frankly still works in the modern disinformation era, which is about as much just confusing people and making them doubt all information and not just getting them to believe the propaganda message you want them to believe. So I think the jury's still out as to whether that presentation of genuine pluralism around debate on an issue can help to break through and get individuals to pay attention to news. That's number one. Number two, it goes back to something Olga was saying, and Vasily as well, you need to have information coming from trusted individuals. So one of the ways that US international broadcasting, particularly in Asia, in the really, really difficult environments to penetrate, such as Tibet, have managed to get information through is to make that information available to those who can access it. Families living in California, people living elsewhere in the world, and letting them get that information through their own means, whether it be email or something else, to their relatives. Now, I know we've heard these stories about calling mom in Russia and she says, I don't believe you, there's bombing. But at some point, people have trusted sources of information, individuals. So a combination, I think, of that, find their trusted sources and have them convey information and present information in such a way that people are going to perceive it as giving them a fuller picture of the situation rather than a biased, one-sided picture of a situation. I think the combination of those two things can help to make a difference.
Olga, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I would like to add to this point about trying to bring the message. You know, there was actually other attempts to bring the message to the Russians, as some of your audience has heard, that there were attempts to send emails and text messages, use messengers to send information about what is going on. I have heard from many of my Russian friends that they see them as advertisement on social media, but also get them through messengers. I didn't see them personally as an advertisement because I'm localized as United States, but I have seen them also when I traveled to Russia and later on in my texts and emails, Russian texts and Russian phone and Russian emails, how they work. I have to say that there were so many of them. And they were very diverse, mostly trying to appeal in a very respectful way, by the way, addressed by other Russians, supposedly, or Americans in Russian language. Sometimes language was Google Translate quality of the language, trying to appeal to Russians in a very respectful way. Some of them would be sending them pictures of the killed children and women and other people. There were many of them. However, here we deal with something in strategic communication when there's too much fearful and negative information and people have no way of trying to resolve this problem. They start to experience inhibition. They're blocking this information and it doesn't really affect them. Another approach seems to be working better, trying to first encourage interaction with the other side, talk with them, hear their story, and then maybe try to influence their opinion by bringing up alternative information which they weren't exposed before. It deals also with family members too. That grandmother or uncle from Russia might not believe what is happening with their own grandchildren or nieces or nephews in Ukraine. Well, hear their story and try to tell them bits and pieces, start slowly, engage in the conversation. And some of these attempts, which also were reported by the media, they work better. When we involve the audience into the discussion, hear them as well, that works much better than just flooding the audience with messages. Then they get ignored because people don't have any power to change that, because people think that they are ignored, their fear and their dangers are being ignored too, about protesting, including, what has happening right now also with this protest of Miss Ovsyannikova, Marina Ovsyannikova. There's also bots flying around the social media trying to undermine her protest and say, oh, what's the big deal? It's a big deal. And we have to respect what Russians are doing there, but also try to hear, the other stories so that we will be able to engage them into this conversation and persuade otherwise.
Thank you, Olga. Muted myself. Vasily, I'm going to give you the last word. If you have anything to add to this before we open up to questions and comments from the audience, I reserve some time for that.
Yes, just few words. I think, and I hope Jeff agrees with me with all his experience, something that should not be done is resorting to war propaganda, answering war propaganda with war propaganda. Even in the coldest day of Cold War, US international broadcasting was, I wouldn't say positive, but it was very respectful to Russians. Things that angry Ukrainians who have children dying under Russian bombs say against Russians indiscriminately. I mean, like Russians bomb Ukraine indiscriminately, Ukrainians indiscriminately kind of curse Russians. Should not be used by anybody else. I mean, this is solely between two nations that are at war. If United States want, and the West in general, want to keep an open track 2, track 3 channels, I mean, they must be not aggressive in pushing their messages out. That should be restrained, possibly even positive where you can. And I think one of these messages that Jeff would remember, I mean, I wrote it to them when they asked, I mean, they have to return to propagation of values of freedom. Just telling people that freedom is better than slavery, that peace is better than war, that prosperity is better than poverty, and like, but this message must be positive. And I think that at least, I mean, current time is doing quite a good work on that.
Thanks, Vasily. I agree with you. And Current Time, for audience that doesn't know, is the 24/7 news stream produced jointly by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America that aims to reach Russian speakers globally, and in fact is expanding its distribution as there's more interest in having programming for Russian speakers following the start of the war in Ukraine. So there's new placement, new availability of content of that particular channel. I agree, it has to stay positive where it can. It demonstrates our values through robust and open debate. It talks about who we are as a society and talking about our own issues as well as international issues. And the heavy news content is leavened where it's appropriate to do so by content that engages in different ways, including even being entertaining as a way to reach out to people. The message of freedom sent by Willis Conover and his jazz programming during the Voice of America made a huge impact behind the Iron Curtain. But I'll leave it at that, Erik, because I know you're eager to get to some of these great questions that are coming in.
No, thank you, Jeff. So I think one question I want to start off with is if anyone can briefly talk about, I think this is a very relevant question. Do you think it will become unsafe for Russians in Russia to communicate with all foreigners on email and social media? What are some best practices for international communication to keep those lines of communication with everyday Russians, like personal relationships, professional? Is it safe to talk about the war, to talk about opposition to the Putin government on, email, social media, messenger? What are some best practices to hopefully maintain the safety of Russians inside Russia who are opposed to the war and communicating about these topics? Any suggestions? Yeah,
yeah, I would like to talk about the first half of your question, whether it's going to be dangerous. Well, not your Dasia's question, whether it's going to be dangerous. I see it already. My colleagues, Russian colleagues and Russian friends, first of all, colleagues, researchers, when they post something on social media, again, they're using it not even for friends only, but very small circles so that nobody else sees that. They handpick the people who will see the message, who they think are safe to see this message. Also, people directly tell me when we talk on the messengers, Olga, we cannot use the word V, which is, and then asterisk V stands for war. Well, we were told that all this information can be intercepted and taken, and we are afraid, we are risking. We have we have elderly parents, we have children, and so on. So yes, there are fears, people are afraid, let alone there were some laws which were introduced before the war, when researchers would have to write reports who they met during the research meetings and professional meetings, what was the discussion about, and all that. So they have to report about these things. It's insane. So we're coming back to the Soviet Union times and quite significant control over that. It's also dangerous to give interviews and to speak up and to call things what they are. With regards to how we can do it differently, maybe Jeff, with his experience working as a journalist in Soviet Union and the late Soviet Union, can share some good advice.
It's a tough one because as we've seen in media accounts in recent days, people are getting picked up on the streets of Moscow, we think using facial recognition software when they're in the metro, based on social media postings that they have done. So we're seeing the Russians starting down a well-trod path by the Chinese who've gone a great distance in this particular respect. I think Olga wanted to jump back in again. Did you have another thought, Olga?
Just as what you said exactly about facial recognition, they're canceling mask mandates in Moscow everywhere, although even with masks, as we know, technology allows us to see the faces, but they are specifically now turning down these mask mandates, even though COVID is still in Russia, it's still there. Yet they're trying to use, besides other things, to be able to recognize people easier. And they stop people, they check their phones, what they're writing about, they force them to unlock the phones, check the messages, and what kind of, even if there's no messages, they check what channels the people read on Telegram, for example.
So people come up with, and Vasily talked about Aesopian language, but people come up with images, different ways to talk about things that are happening. This becomes a part of the cat and mouse game use of language, as we've seen from the evidence in China, where it became impossible to find images of Winnie the Pooh after people started using Winnie the Pooh as a meme for Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping looks a little like Winnie the Pooh, and suddenly you couldn't find Winnie the Pooh on the internet any longer. So I would anticipate this kind of gamesmanship and back and forth that being played out, but with very serious potential consequences. Stick to the encrypted apps if you possibly can. They're not foolproof, and the intelligence agencies around the world work very, very hard to break them, but certainly you give yourself some measure of additional protection by using the more encrypted, the better encrypted apps rather than communicating openly on email, for instance.
Great. Switching to another question, And I think this is a larger question. I think it's a good question because I think this is in the minds of many Americans as we've talked about the amount of political control and dystopia in Russia. The question is, does public opinion matter in Russia? What is the practical influence of whether people actually do support or oppose the war? Does it matter in the short term? Does it matter in the long term in terms of the course of the war or political change? Any perspectives on that? Let's start with Vasily, and then I'm sure others do as well.
I would say it is very important in the short term, because although the regime started to change, kind of started to evolve in something more ugly and disastrous, it still is addicted to ratings, to kind of approval of Putin's policy or whatever policies conducted in Russia. That's in a way, it's kind of a toxic masculinity. I mean, I'm the first. I mean, I'm the best, and I mean, polls approve that. So far, they are very, very attentive to polling. If it goes into real totalitarian direction, which is quite possible, especially if they find the level of discontent and the level of disapproval growing, they would judge for fate. I don't think they have resources, I mean, quantitative resources to control the country the same way Communist Party controlled it, but they will try. And I'm pretty sure if they go this way, this is a good sign that everything else doesn't work. So they can't go back to normal.
Olga or Jeff, do you want to add to that?
Yes, as a person who studies public opinion for a long period of time and experimented with it, given the different circumstances for various kinds of studies, I would have to say that, of course, yes, public opinion matters in Russia. There are topics where it can be manipulated by the propaganda, and there are topics where that can be manipulated less. Or harder there, and we see that now in the experiments we have conducted here in the United States and in Russia. It's actually one of the reasons why they are putting all this effort, propaganda effort, because opinion matters. They need some support for their effort. That's why they're working in that direction. If the regime turns even further towards the totalitarian direction, and it will be, and it already does, target the discontent and dissent inside the country, of course, given the situation. I think measurements, public opinion research will still be going on. How much of that we can see remains to be seen. But, really, we are able to conduct opinion studies even in quite controlled areas such as Belarus and China right now, especially with the technology which is available right now. So we will still be able to collect this information. Domestically, it could be a question. And of course, there will be much tighter control on what is being studied and how it's being analyzed. And unfortunate for these leaders, how it's being presented to them, because often the messenger is the first one who gets shot. And this is actually poses a problem to the authoritarian and totalitarian rulers. They don't get to see the real picture then.
Oh. Olga, and Vasily may have thoughts on this, and it's a very subjective question, I suspect, but it has to do with the extent to which the public is programmed at this point. So if tonight on Vremya, the nightly news, and all of the other main programs, the announcers went on and said, you know what, we're going to be best friends with the United States. And I mean, if they really laid on that message, and it could even be, I mean, if you want to posit it, it could be, say Putin disappears, say he's removed somehow, and somebody else steps in, and that somebody overnight turns 180 degrees on Russia and the attitude toward the world, will people go along with it, or will it take more than that to get them to change their views? How deeply rooted are the American anti-Western views that are held at this point?
You know, having observed polling data for already decades and looking at the trend data, how opinion about United States, let's take United States opinion, right, changed over time. It would go up. Over 70% of Russians thinking that the United States is the major friend, to 70% thinking that it's their major enemy. It went down, up and down several times, actually. One of the latest lows between self-perception between Russia and the United States was following the annexation of Crimea. And then it started to move closer to the more neutral kind of attitude among Russians, right? So it was and before that, during the Yugoslavia conflict, right? We've seen quite significant change. In between, during the war in Georgia and South Ossetia. So there were several periods when we have seen ups and downs. It goes back, maybe not completely, but it can change. There's another thing I wanna say. I see sometimes right now opinions that 60-70% of Russians approving the war. This is not really true. In fact, there's only 1/3. As much as I would like to believe that, I would say that's just wishful thinking. I have heard this talk about approval ratings of Mr. Putin, but no matter who measures it, state-controlled or independent pollsters, we still see majority supporting him. There's reasons for that. Propaganda, one of them, right? I do think that the real support for Mr. Putin or for the war is the firm support is much less than 60%. So there is significant amount of those Russians who are, so to say, persuadables. And if the environment changes, especially media environment changes, we will see significant changes in the public opinion too, and very fast. Something that Vasily also mentioned when he said that things change very quickly in such societies, but also something I have observed watching public opinion, not only in Russia, but in also some other nations. Russia is not an exception to the rule here. I think that the firm support, the nucleus of Mr. Putin's and his adventures is much less than 2/3. It's between 1/4 to 1/3, and the rest are really persuadables.
I want to get another question in real quick here. A couple different commenters brought up Tucker Carlson, and Fox News and some of his personalities, and such as Tucker Carlson and others, have leading up to the Russia's war on Ukraine been very supportive of Russia or of Putin, have been very dismissive of the concerns about Ukraine, and even now you have right-wing outlets repeating and amplifying Russian propaganda about biolabs in Ukraine, or providing justification for Russia's invasion, or providing conspiracy theories. What role, at least the United States, are these right-wing personalities or outlets playing back in Russia? Is Russian media, Russian government pointing, oh, look, here's some American personalities and sources that are agreeing with us? Are they using this as a propaganda moment or not? And what impact does that have?
They love the validation, and I'll just leave it with that to my colleagues to expand on that, Erik, but only adding that there's some of that coming out of the far left part of the political spectrum as well in recent days. That's been sort of amazing to see, but I yield to my colleagues on this answer.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jeff.
Yeah, that was exactly, Jeff. There was this famous interview, for example, Carson and Tulsi Gabbard, left and right, both of them were there talking. It was very quickly translated into Russian, dubbed with very good voices, high quality, shown on major propaganda TV channels domestically in Russia and spread around social media very actively. And you have to understand, we might know in the United States who is Tucker Carlson. In Russia, people have no idea. It's a foreign journalist, apparently presented as a very popular one and a prominent figure. So Russians here, speaking about validation, that prominent American journalists disagreeing with all this outdated policy that that the swamp is narrating to the audiences. And of course, this creates the impression that not necessarily all United States, not necessarily all West or Euro-Atlantic part of the world is supporting the sanctions and is opposing the war that Russia wages against Ukraine. Unfortunately, these hard right outlets amplifying the propaganda in Russia, also helping Russians in some way in persuading their own audience that something that they do is not necessarily that bad.
Right, right.
Yeah, I will only kind of support Olga on that, because I mean, Tucker Carlson is quoted on both RT and other Russian channels extensively. Every word he says kind of against Russian policy of President Biden is immediately translated, immediately posted, discussed at this awful talk shows that they broadcast now for like 6 hours a day, where participants are screaming on each other in the patriotic vigor. I mean, as we speak, there is a program called 60 Minutes. They discuss, I mean, what country they will attack next. I'm just telling you, I mean, they just discuss, I mean, should we crash Estonia and make Tallinn our new target, or we go to Warsaw? Really, I mean,
the leading anchors in these talk shows are talking right now about Lithuania, Baltics, and even Poland.
Right, right.
And
scary stuff.
That's, well, I mean, you never know. I mean, this sometimes the voices of idiots probably are better than intelligence.
Right, they forecast possibly the talking points that the Russian government wants to put out. They test them by using different media outlets and see what may resonate or not in terms of testing their sort of foreign policy choices. And
yeah.
And with that, I think we've run out of time. So I want to thank all of you for your insights today, your input. I've greatly enjoyed the conversation. I want to thank the audience for joining us today, for your questions. And I hope this has been educational for those of you who joined us today. I'm sure that we'll be paying attention. I want to thank the Buffett Institute for hosting us today and providing support for our panel. I want to thank Reese at Northwestern, as well as helping co-organize this panel. So thank you all, and thank you very much. And we hope to continue the conversation on this and other pressing questions soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.